In today's episode, exploring China's Air Force encirclement of Taiwan. Unveiling latest material and data on the crisis. China's increasing presence around Taiwan. In-depth analysis of intrusions into Taiwanese ADIZ. Escalating situation observed since last year. Stay informed on Asia's security challenges.
Hi everyone, today we have a very unique guest. I've met him on Twitter and he has a very interesting account. It's Ben Lewis. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
So maybe you could say a few words about yourself and how did you come up with an idea? You have a very special, very unique account. Where does your interest come from and where does your knowledge about this topic come from?
So I'm an independent defense analyst. I'm based in Washington, D.C. For most of the time. And I run a database that tracks Chinese military aircraft incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. I discovered the ADIZ reports that the MND, Ministry of National Defense for Taiwan, puts out when I was stuck in a hotel because my college dorm had black mold. And so I was trapped there and I found this and I was like, whoa, this is really weird. I didn't see a lot of people talking about it at the time. That was in September of 2021. And I started to kind of build a little spreadsheet on my laptop about it. And I started to tweet about it a little bit. And I got introduced to a friend, someone who became a friend who had the original version of the tracker, kind of like the bread and butter of the thing that I run now. And over time, I kept following it, and that friend ended up making the transition to government, and he asked if I wanted to take over the database, and I was like, absolutely, I'm already tracking it every day anyway. So, and since then, I took it over on August 1st, 2022, and then 2 days later, Nancy Pelosi landed in Taipei, and it was very much out of the frying pan into the fire kind of thing. But I mean, it's been a lot of fun. I have a bachelor's in international affairs from George Washington University in D.C., and my focus was on Taiwan security issues and the PLA. And so it tied in very nicely. It was a very easy way to get some research papers done without having to do a lot of source collection. So and since then it's just been a really great part of my life.
Yeah, so you started with Nancy Pelosi's visit in Taiwan. So what do you think what has changed from that time? Like, how was it before? I guess much calmer. And what are the changes? Are there any new stages since then? Because the PLA had actually two huge exercises around Taiwan. Once was Nancy Pelosi, then Tsai Ing-wen meeting McCarthy. So could you tell a little bit how do you see it with your tracker? What can you observe?
Yeah, so pre-August of 22, pre-Pelosi visit, the PLA's activities around Taiwan were less, I want to say, substantial consistently and more kind of, I would say, an attempt to normalize the behavior of flying into the ADIZ and sending military aircraft around Taiwan in general. There were obviously instances where there were very large violations for PRC National Day. Right after I found the ADIZ stuff in general was the first week of October of 2021. That's when we had the highest number of planes in one day. We had 56 aircraft. That's never been beaten. And it's been, almost 2 years. And so, but from Pelosi onwards, the biggest change that I noticed was median line crossings. When the MND first started putting out information about ADIZ violations at the end of 2020, there were about 30 plus ADIZ violations. And then there was kind of a 2-year gap. There was one, I think in May of 2022, that was kind of it was a helicopter or something random. But from August onward, median line crossings were as common or more common than any other kind of ADIZ incursion. And so that was a really major change because functionally speaking, the PLA essentially erased the median line as a functional boundary as a consequence of their operations in August. And in addition to that, from the beginning of when the MND started releasing information about this, which I should mention, it was happening before that. They just weren't putting out reports about it. The MND, I think, has a tendency to kind of go at its own pace when sharing information about stuff. But there's been a trend of increasing complexity and increasing diversity. So in regards to increasing complexity, what we've seen is that the ADIZ is big. The MND uses a de facto ADIZ, which there's a part of the ADIZ because it was drawn by the United States.
MND is the Ministry of Defense, right?
Yes, Ministry of National Defense.
Yeah.
The ADIZ, the big cube kind of thing that shows up on the maps that they put out, was drawn by the United States back when the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty was still active back in the 50s. And it covers a large portion of mainland China. It goes up into Fujian province and various and sundry other places. And today, functionally, the Ministry of National Defense uses a de facto ADIZ, which they actually put out a map of inadvertently after the April 2023 exercises. But essentially, it ends at the median line. And so inside that kind of smaller version
like
of the ADIZ.
Updated ADIZ, updated by the Taiwanese side, and it ends at the median line.
That's correct. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And so that's why
usually what you see in the mainstream media is the older, bigger ADIZ. So you're saying
right.
There's a newer one, an updated one.
There is. And they won't ever say that officially because there are obvious concerns about, is that official change in status of Taiwan? Because like everything else, Taiwan has claims on Indian territory in the Himalayas and stuff. And it's just because they can't say that they don't anymore, or because the PRC may interpret that as a declaration of independence or a change of status, something that could start a war. And the ADIZ is no different. But functionally speaking, if you look at the maps they put out every day, the only aircraft they put on the map itself are aircraft that cross over the median line or pass kind of an extension of the median line. And so that's been a change from prior. I think back in the 90s, there was when the PLA Air Force started to kind of grow up a little bit. They sent aircraft into the Taiwan Strait and other things, and I think the MND's boundaries were a little different. But inside that de facto ADIZ, there are a number of zones that I've kind of created through looking at the data based on how the MND responds to them and how they chart them. And over time, the PLA has consistently expanded what zones they send aircraft in. So it used to be the priority was the southwest area. That's still the most common. So you have a lot of bases across the Taiwan Strait. You fly into the southwest. But since August especially, we've seen a lot of median line violations. That's another zone. So that's 2. The southern ADIZ, which is kind of the very bottom right corner of the de facto ADIZ, will have aircraft come up into it from other areas, either from the South China Sea, if they fly through Luzon and come up, or we have no idea really where they're coming from, but we see them enter. The eastern ADIZ now is very common because PLA Navy vessels will launch helicopters, and they're on the east side of Taiwan, and the MND will track them over there. And then the northeast ADIZ as well. There'll be aircraft that come down kind of into the top right corner. And so over time, the complexity of these single days will have sometimes 4 different areas represented by aircraft flight paths, which is a really substantial change from what we saw before. And it shows that the PLA is really trying to work on covering the whole board, so to speak, in their training. And then additionally, diversity, which I think is kind of a little more interesting, is the kinds of aircraft we're seeing now. And what kinds of aircraft fly together is way different from before. So you had a lot of special mission and support aircraft from the end of 2020 onwards. That was kind of the most common type of flight, which was, you'd have a Y-8 anti-submarine warfare or Y-8Q, which would just fly kind of what the PLA would want you to call a routine sortie. That's what, in some of my research, I've called it a routine style sortie. Into the ADIZ. It would fly a path, leave, or you'd have an electronic warfare aircraft, and then occasionally you'd have some fighter jets, or a helicopter that was probably also anti-submarine warfare. But as time has progressed, especially since August, you've had the addition of UAVs, at least officially, from the Ministry of National Defense's reports. We knew there were drones in the ADIZ before they started releasing them, but officially now they're very common. They've made up about 10% of all aircraft tracked in the ADIZ since September 5th, when they were first tracked. But you see command and control aircraft, a number of different kinds of fighters. Strategic bombers had been something that has been seen before, but are now more common. But the kind of bread and butter of it is that they're flying together. And you'll have days where, as in April, on April 10th, there were 13 different airframes tracked, 13 different kinds of aircraft tracked.
And you also mentioned helicopters, right?
Right. So it's fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft flying at the same time. Special mission and support aircraft. We've seen the Y-20U aerial refueling aircraft, the KJ-500 airborne early warning and command aircraft, loads of fighter jets, Su-30s, J-10s, J-15s in April, J-16s, J-11s. Almost the entire PLA Air Force has been represented now.
We could say it's both a change, both in quantity and quality, right?
Exactly. Right.
So is there a difference between Nancy Pelosi's visit and then meeting with McCarthy? Is there like a difference? Because we have to add, they also have one aircraft carrier that also showed up. So it seems like it's really more and more crowded.
Yes. And there was I think that was probably one of the biggest differences, besides length and kind of composition of the exercises themselves, is that the Shandong was in the Western Pacific. And that was the first time we had ever seen J-15s inside the ADIZ, and the first time.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
Carrier-based aircraft subsequently were tracked in the ADIZ. And that's very important because they weren't by themselves. They were conducting carrier-based air operations at the same time they were conducting land-based air operations. That's a substantial development in PLA operations. That we've never seen them do that in and around Taiwan's ADIZ. And so that was a very large difference. I think, obviously the April exercises were only 3 days, and we had the largest 3-day total of ADIZ violations across that time. And the August was a different beast in and of itself. We had over 400 aircraft in the ADIZ that month, and that was really unlike anything I've ever seen before, and hopefully I'll never see it again. But I would say that August was August was the turning point in regards to the kind of progression of
August Pelosi's visit.
Correct. August of 2022. That month of activities was the definitive turning point in the ADIZ saga, so to speak. Since that time, the number of aircraft in each month has continually been much higher than anything we saw pre-August. In 2023 so far, there has not been a month where we've seen less than 100 planes tracked inside the ADIZ. And that's unheard of from pre-August of 2022.
You mean monthly or
monthly?
Daily? Monthly. Okay,
monthly.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah, we've never seen a triple-digit single-day total. I would that might be the thing that sends me to my grave if I ever see that come across my phone. But every month in 2023, there's been over 100 aircraft tracked, which is an over 100 month pre-August of 2022, pre-Pelosi, would have been very notable in the data. And now it's kind of
before nobody even mentioned it. And then since Pelosi came here, then it became a topic. And now it's not even a topic because it's just the new normal. So that it's just basically what happens every day, not even a newsworthy.
Exactly. And I would say that is probably an area where Beijing has had great success, in that, when they first started back in late 2020, the MND started releasing information about what was going on in the ADIZ. It got some attention, especially because it was over the median line. And then there was pretty much 2 years where there were some really large sorties like the National Day in 2021. But really, we used to say that 10 plus, and I still do, was a reactionary violation. It was really, this is something notable, 10 or more aircraft. Now 10 or more aircraft, it's like kind of peas, and what I've seen, especially as someone who, talks to press about this, is, I used to get emails and calls when there were 10 or 15 aircraft inside the ADIZ. Now there can be 20 or 25 and no one reaches, no one cares. And I understand that because it's become so frequent that it's impossible to keep the 24-hour news cycle focused on this one thing every single day. But that's Beijing knows that. And so one of the objectives of all of this, all of these operations around Taiwan, is to normalize it. They want to degrade and change the status quo to a state that's extremely capricious. And they want to do that because, for one, they want to show that to Taiwan as kind of a psychological operation that, look, we can fly around you and now nobody cares, right? And we can do it whenever we want. We can send as many planes as we want. There's nothing you can do about it, right? It's a very kind of gray zone style
There is still
operation.
one issue maybe we could talk. You mentioned UAVs, and do you also track missiles like the ones that were shot above Taiwan and then also to the Japanese EEZ? Like, let's talk maybe about the UAVs, and then if you know, then maybe a bit about missiles.
Sure. So we've seen a number of different kinds of UAVs tracked inside the ADIZ. Some are very common now, some are less frequent. So the BZK-005 is a reconnaissance UAV that's probably one of the most common. The TB-001 is one of the UAVs that completed the encirclement flight around Taiwan. And, UAVs, we've seen them used to great success in Ukraine, and they've been something that the Chinese have been working on developing for a number of years. They're one of China's biggest weapons exports to the global south. And so subsequently, as China develops its forces and tries new kinds of compositions of aircraft, integrating UAVs to those flights is very important because they're going to play a role if a Taiwan contingency takes place. And so, I think UAVs are unique because I've kind of seen Beijing use them as a way to push the envelope, but to keep it the situation relatively stable as they do. And I think the circumnavigations of Taiwan is a great example of that, where they circumnavigated and it was a big deal, but they sent a drone. There was no Chinese pilot up there.
Yeah, it's maybe
and,
like a lesser evil. Like, oh, what
right,
do you
very
do?
much so.
Right? Yeah.
Very much so. And so, with that, I think, and I've seen this in other instances too, using UAVs to kind of test the waters, so to speak, with certain kinds of flights. And I definitely foresee that continuing. And I think UAVs will they've already become a very normal thing. And, we haven't seen a new type of UAV in a very long time. But in regards to the missiles, I mean, the only time in my lifetime, at least, that, missiles have been fired the only time ever over Taiwan was back in August, and around Taiwan. They did that back in the 90s, ahead of the 1996 elections during the Taiwan Straits crisis. And so what we saw in August was they fired 11 missiles. Some went over Taiwan, some went around. One at least landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone, which was a clear signal to Tokyo from Beijing. It was very intentional. Since then, we haven't seen that. There was none of that in April. That was a really major difference. I probably should have mentioned that before. That was probably the biggest difference, was that there were no missile tests. And, I think you mentioned talking about that Hudson Institute presentation,
One more thing, I wanted to come back
Sure.
to the missiles, because as you probably know, they intended to fire 16 and they fired only 11. So it's not a good sign. And I just realized maybe it's somehow related to the recent problems of the missile force, where people were demoted and arrested recently, and They had so much trouble because of the report that was published end of last year in the US. So maybe that's all also related to the missiles that actually didn't stand the test. If that's true, that they intended to fire 16, only 11 were released, and now we have all those problems with the missile force that was actually, a, like a showcase for China's military. So maybe that's all somehow related, that they are not really as developed, as advanced as they wanted to be, as they wanted to look like. Do you think there is a relation?
I think it's possible. I mean, the PLARF, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force,
Yeah.
Historically and now, I think has been probably one of, if not the most advanced branches of the PLA. It's very hard there's so much beneath the surface politically that goes into, PLA operations, because it is a party army and not a nation state military. I think that's definitely possible. I'm sure there are others who can come up with a list of other things, but all in all, I think, one of the things that makes tracking, the PLA, the Rocket Force, the Air Force, the whole 9 yards of it so interesting, but also very challenging, is that at the end of the day, you have no idea. You only know what you can see that can be confirmed in the open source, because they're not going to tell you anything. And so with something like this, that's very possible. I could believe that. I could believe that there are some other weird political undercurrent, that kind of subsequently resulted in demotions and arrests, and then the 16 number could have just been something for propaganda, and they really only wanted to fire 11, or at the last minute they decided, we don't want anyone picking up this wreckage, so we're not going to fire this missile. It could be like a number of things, but I think it kind of just goes to show one of the many challenges of monitoring this kind of thing, whether you're doing it all the time, like I am, and you have no life, or you're just doing it casually, is that it's just, there's so much beneath the surface that is almost incomprehensibly unique due to the political system, due to the opaqueness, and due to just kind of the rapid progression of the Chinese military in the last 20 years has made it just interesting and weird.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
Good. Let's get to the second part, the Kyle Bass speech and presentation in the Hudson Institute, right?
Yeah. So I had a lot of problems with the presentation, and I think it has a lot of good information just kind of to look at. But I think, the biggest problem that I had was the presentation, essentially the crux of it regarding the PLA development side of it, was that the PLA has to complete 3, quote unquote, simulations to prove to Xi that their forces are ready to invade Taiwan. And then subsequently that 2 of these simulations have already been completed. I just think that's utterly ridiculous. There's never been any kind of research or declassified intelligence reports that have suggested that there's a specific checklist of what Xi and the Central Military Commission need to see in order to kind of think that they're ready to attack Taiwan. And then subsequently, the examples that were given in the presentation, the first was the August 2022 exercises. And speaking of the missiles, this was kind of the crux of that firing 11 missiles over and around Taiwan was enough to simulate the total annihilation of Taiwan's air defense systems. That's total BS. There's nothing that could even remotely suggest that, though that test specifically could prove that the PLA could accomplish something as difficult as that. Missiles are very complicated. When you attack a target with missiles, it's never, you fire one missile and you destroy it. That rarely occurs. And so, I think that, like everything else, because the Chinese have not fought a war since 1979, and the PLA of 1979 and the PLA of 2023 are 2 completely different armies. There's, the idea that they are going to checklist 3 heavily scripted simulations as we can now undertake the most complex military operation in the world is totally bonkers, in my opinion. And, similarly, the idea of the April 2023 Operation Joint Sword, April 9th of 2023, the PLAN and the aviation forces from the PLA conducted joint aerial naval strikes on strategic targets in Taiwan. That was what the Chinese state media had said. And they said it went really well. And I'm sure they would say that, of course. So they're not gonna say that, oh man, we really did a really piss poor job at this, And so the presentation to the Hudson Institute essentially said that, this is proof that they can rapidly deploy naval and air forces and use them to conduct strikes on Taiwan and complete a blockade. And that there's just not enough evidence to support that. And the final point was that, the third simulation that we haven't seen the PLA do yet is an amphibious assault simulation. And, probably the most important takeaway, if everything else I've said today is thrown in the trash, is that amphibious assault is the hardest possible thing to do when you go to war with someone. If you're going to fight someone, it's really convenient to have a land border, because if you have to go across water, it gets so much more complicated. And in the circumstances of Taiwan, it's not like, the Chinese have been preparing to invade Taiwan for 70 years and Taiwan's been sitting there like, yeah, it's fine. Everything's fine, right? We're not. It's been a subsequent development on both sides, right? So you have 11 or 12 beaches in Taiwan that are even suitable to land forces on. Really, only 2 of those are like the really pristine beaches, and Taiwan knows what they are, just like everybody. I know what they are, so believe me, the MND knows what they are, right? And so for 70 years, Taiwan has been preparing to defend those beaches. So that means that if you're going to send a number of, PLA ground force amphibious units to attack these beaches, it's going to be really, really hard to do. And they've never practiced amphibious assault at scale. They've done a lot of small exercises and they've learned a lot, the Chinese have.
At that scale, no one ever has.
Right, exactly. That's something, we haven't seen something that large since World War II.
Even the US Navy, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and at least, generally speaking, the U.S. military has had a lot of combat experience in the last 20 years, right? But the Chinese haven't. And they have all this new equipment and all these new systems and all these nice new ships. And you can't just, buying a toy doesn't mean you know how to play with it, essentially, right?
Yeah, but I have to say in their defense, they practice hell a lot. Like they're always out in the sea, they're always out in the air. And what we just discussed in the first half, surrounding Taiwan, flying around, provoking everyone, that's okay, that's not war, but that's kind of exercise. They're always out, out there practicing, training. It counts for a lot. I mean, they burn so much money on all of this. That's probably more than all the neighbors together. So you have to grant them that at least they practice a lot, and that might be helpful in such a case.
I think they do practice a lot. I would say that the challenge with major PLA exercises and minor, and less so now than before, but still it's a very large problem, is that they're scripted. And it's not just in the media. It's that, back in 2021, late 2021, there was an exercise where they simulated sinking a U.S. carrier strike group or a carrier strike group, right? And it went perfectly. And, it probably won't go perfectly. Nothing goes perfectly in wartime, right? And so, yes, they're practicing a lot, but it's a lot like, if you're practicing something in American football or soccer, and it's like, we're going to run a play here, we're going to run a pattern, and oh, look, our receiver catches the ball every single time. Great job, guys. I can't wait for Sunday. We're going to really dominate. You can't. You have to have real red team, real OPFOR, opposing forces, to challenge you. And you have to be willing to admit that there are areas that you're just not ready to do yet. And I think the concern of a lot of people who monitor the PLA is that they don't have that. They're getting better, but for a very long time, and still today with the major exercises, there's a concern, I think, among PLA leadership, especially kind of lower level commanders, that if they do a real exercise and their forces lose and they lose hard, that it could hurt their career. It could, there's a number of considerations for that. And I think, especially when it comes to amphibious exercises, the complexity of that, when you have a lack of really authentic training, that is really going to delay you in your
Also, we
ability
could
to.
add in an army that is probably very corrupt, and probably not always promotions based on merit, so that might be even more difficult.
Yes, the PLA is not as corrupt as it used to be, but there's still a lot of problems. There's a lot of
Good.
problems.
So my last question would be, or maybe two last questions. I wanted to ask you what we started with, a little bit about your background. How do you get your knowledge? How do you do the research? Because you seem to speak comfortably about a lot of military topics, but you're, I guess, a civilian. So how do you know so much, and how do you prepare? How do you do your research?
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
So, for one thing, I mean, I've studied China academically for about 4 years, and I had the benefit of having a lot of professors who taught me kind of how to look at things. But for the ADIZ stuff and kind of the current events, what's happening right now, it's a lot of open source. So, I've managed to kind of develop a stream of sources through friends and just kind of on social media and on the internet that can give me a lot of information. The MND reports is probably kind of the crux of that every day at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm looking at my phone waiting for the map. And then from there, it's just, it's if you familiarize yourself with kind of what you're being told, and there's a learning curve, it's a lot of time spent. There's a lot of reference books that I bought that help a lot. But, I have my academic background helps a lot too, just because that's, I wrote a thesis on Taiwan's defense. And so I spent a lot of time doing research and familiarizing.
Do you also talk to or maybe meet military personnel? Do you have like that kind of face-to-face interaction?
I haven't yet. I'd love to. If the MND ever wanted to have me over, I have a lot of ideas. But I am fortunate to have some contacts in Taiwan that have the ability to reach out to the MND. So if I really have a question, I really want to bother them, I can ask.
Cool.
Have
you ever been here?
I haven't. I was going to go, and then career considerations prevented me from traveling. But I'm hoping to come in the first half of 2024. It's top of my list of priorities.
Good. My last question would be what you mentioned kind of briefly, the feedback, like who asks you about, you said the media contacts you sometimes. So who is interested in, let's say, in those issues, and what do they do with it? Like they just publish it, or what happens with your knowledge? How do you kind of bring it to the public?
So I kind of got my start doing the media thing with Taiwan Plus. I have a good friend over there, Jaime Okan, who's a fantastic reporter. And so I've done a lot of work for them, done a lot of interviews, and then really it kind of, as things flare up at given times, so April, back in December, a number of Western media outlets have reached out to me in Europe and the United States to ask questions. Mostly they find my Twitter and they think maybe this guy can give me some numbers. And I've been published twice. I wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations on kind of the change in the addition of median line crossings to ADIZ incursions. And then I wrote a piece kind of encapsulating all of 2022's ADIZ activity for CSIS. Brian Hart's team is really great over there. So yeah, mostly it's just kind of the odd, someone will write me and say, do you have any opinions about this? And I'll give my 2 cents. But I'm hoping to kind of publish some more stuff relatively soon. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Ben, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. Very informative. Thank you a lot.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.